to our third talk on What Should Universities Be series. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome our very own Bob Brecher. You probably all know him. If not, you should. He's Professor of Moral Philosophy here in the Humanities. He founded, along with a couple of others, the Humanities programme. So it's the Bob that you should all thank if you love it, students. Okay, the nature of it. He's going to talk today about neoliberalism, I believe. So over to Bob. We'll talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll have questions. Okay?
Thanks very much, Anthony, and thanks to everybody for turning up. I'm not known for showing pictures, but this I couldn't resist. I didn't make it up. It's an advert from the Times Hire, which is the trade rag for academics in the UK. And they've been running it for 3 successive weeks. Now, I think it tells us something about the neoliberal university. What it tells us is that even the people doing the advertising don't know what they're doing. Because this isn't coffee, it's instant bloody coffee. So, let me start off by quoting from the website of a university in the United Kingdom. This was put on the website a few weeks ago.
This is what it says. Dear colleague, I'm pleased to inform you that the results from the 2015 National Student Survey show a welcome increase in the number of our final year students reporting satisfaction with their courses. The headline results show overall satisfaction was 83%, a 1-point increase on our results from 2014. Our score is 3% below the sector average of 86%, but this clearly is a step in the right direction. Now, for the older colleagues among us, this will of course be redolent of the Soviet tractor production figures of the 1970s. And it ought perhaps to be met with the same ridicule. But then, ridicule is not enough. It's not enough because what this represents is in fact neoliberalism's engineering of the human soul. And as Stalin so fetchingly put it in his backhanded compliment to the novelists of his revolution, quote, "The production of souls is more important than the production of tanks." And therefore I raise my glass to you, writers, the engineers of human souls. And central to that engineering of the human soul is the neoliberals' insistence on stupidity, to which ideological issue I shall return in a little while. But first, if we're going to understand the neoliberals' ideological agenda for our universities, we need to try first to get clear what the realities of neoliberalism are, at least in outline. So I'm going to start with Sir Alfred Sherman, Thatcher's beloved guru. Here's what, according to Ian Gilmore, he told the London correspondent of Pravda in January 1984. If the unemployed get lower benefits, they'll be quicker to start looking for work. As for the lumpen proletariat, coloured people and the Irish, let's face it, the only way to hold them in check is to have enough properly trained police. Or if you want to come up to date a little more, let's fast forward to Milton Friedman's disarming honesty in the wake of the New Orleans hurricane in 2005. Here's what he said. Most New Orleans schools are in ruins, as are the homes of the children who've attended them. These children are now scattered all over the country. This is a tragedy. It's also an opportunity to radically reform the education system. The point is, of course, that today's neoliberal hegemony isn't some sort of accident. It's not one particular outcome of Reagan's and Thatcher's contingent election victories of the late 1970s. Rather, it's the outcome of a very carefully prepared conspiracy hidden in full sight. It's a conspiracy that started in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Worried that the post-war and post-depression compromise that capitalism was having to make with at least something like socialism or social democracy, and worried even more about the sort of example that the Soviet Union might, in principle, constitute for people disaffected by the pre-war liberal consensus, a shadowy group of, quote, like-minded scholars, and that quote is from themselves, of like-minded scholars founded the Mont Pelerin Society. Let me quote from the Society's website. It's all up there for everybody to see. Here's what they say about themselves. After World War II in 1947, when many of the values of Western civilization were imperilled, 36 scholars, mostly economists with some historians and philosophers, were invited by Professor Friedrich von Hayek to meet at Mont Pelerin in Montreux, Switzerland, to discuss the state and the possible fate of liberalism, in its classical sense, in thinking and practice. The group emphasised that it didn't intend to create an orthodoxy, to form or align itself with any political party or parties, or to conduct propaganda. Its sole objective was to facilitate an exchange of ideas between like-minded scholars in the hope of strengthening the principles and practice of a free society and to study the workings, virtues and defects of market-oriented economic systems. Well, that's their propaganda. The reality is slightly different. And one of the best guides to that reality is that offered by Philip Mirowski in his Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, published 2 years ago now. Let me give you a flavour of what Mirowski says. First, and crucially, quote, neoliberalism as worldview has sunk its roots deep into everyday life, almost to the point of passing as the ideology of no ideology. Second, and barely less important, is the fact that, quote, mature neoliberalism is not at all enamoured of the minimalist night watchman state of the classical liberal tradition. Its major distinguishing characteristic is instead a set of proposals and programmes to infuse, take over and transform the strong state in order to impose the ideal form of society, which they conceive to be in pursuit of their very curious icon of pure freedom. And so, quote again, as Hayek once wrote, it would be impossible to assert that a free society will always and necessarily develop values of which we would approve, or even, as we'll see, that it'll maintain values which are compatible with the preservation of freedom. Close quote. So, again as Mirowski puts it, quote, the starting point of neoliberalism is the admission, contrary to classical liberal doctrine, that their vision of the good society will triumph only if it becomes reconciled to the fact that the conditions for its existence must be constructed and will not come about naturally in the absence of concerted political effort and organisation. It needs a strong state as both producer and guarantor of a stable market society. And that's why Mirowski goes on to conclude on this that, quote, a primary ambition of the neoliberal project is to redefine the shape and functions of the state, not to destroy it. Third, then, there's neoliberalism's denial of the very possibility of knowledge as something that human beings have. Hence its stress on stupidity, as I suggested before. This is what Hayek has to say, quote, the case for individual freedom rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable ignorance of us all. The inevitable ignorance of us all. And so, as Mirowski has it, quote, central to neoliberalism is a core conviction that the market really does know better than any one of us what is good for ourselves and for society. And what Hayek goes on to say in retrospective support for this interpretation of Mirovsky's is precisely this. There's not much reason to believe that if any one time the best knowledge which some possess were made available to all, the result would be a much better society. Knowledge and ignorance are relative concepts. Let's think about that. Knowledge and ignorance are relative concepts. Well, if knowledge and ignorance are indeed relative concepts, as Hayek insists in the Constitution of Liberty, then the entire Enlightenment project of progress based on reason is of course quite unworkable. Indeed, only the market can protect us from the delusions and thus the power of people who think that they do actually know something, as Hayek himself had already argued in his seminal Road to Serfdom. This is what he says there, and it's disarmingly honest. Quote, "The only alternative to the submission to the impersonal and seemingly irrational forces of the market is submission to an equally uncontrollable and therefore arbitrary power of other men." And I think he meant men. So, to go back to Mirovsky, it's because liberalism posits the market as, quote, "an information processor more powerful than any human brain," that we must subordinate ourselves entirely to that market. And it's also why the whole Enlightenment project has to be rejected. Neoliberalism, one might say, would have had to invent postmodern scepticism if the left hadn't done so on its behalf. Now, of course, if this view turned out to be false, its central argument for what it's pleased to call the free market disappears. And quite obviously it is false. Otherwise neither Hayek nor any other true believer could be in a position to make the claim that they do, because to do so would be to perform an obvious contradiction. Here as elsewhere, the simple point is that if relativism is true, then it cannot be true that relativism is true. That so much of the left of the late 20th century should have been stupid enough to regard the cruder forms of postmodern relativism as a tool of emancipation will hopefully turn out, eventually, to be one of the odder twists of the history of ideas and of political movements. Nonetheless, contradictory though it is, postmodern scepticism about knowledge remains a powerful position, and neoliberalism feeds on it. The source of its nourishment is later 19th century social Darwinism, 100 years later known as sociobiology, and now known as evolutionary psychology. Now, remember that for neoliberalism, what counts as knowledge is whatever the market is said to predict. Just as whatever is the case of whoever is said to have succeeded in life is what counts as success, just as intelligence is said to consist in high IQ, because IQ is said to measure intelligence, so the market is infallible, because what the market is said to do is exactly what counts as knowledge. That's what the claim amounts to, that, quote, "prices in an efficient market contain all relevant information and therefore cannot be predicted by mere mortals," as Mirovsky has it. To say this in a slightly different way, the dictum is that only the market produces knowledge, and since monetary value is thus the only criterion of any judgment at all that the market, i.e. the neoliberals, recognises, so only that is knowledge which has monetary value. No monetary value, no status as knowledge. Now, it's of course the case that this sort of reasoning, if that's not putting it too strongly, is ridiculous. But it's also of course the case that it is influential and likely to become more so as critical analysis is sidelined in the face of relativism, resilience, and all the other comforting nonsenses of identity politics in general and identity thinking in particular. For of course, social Darwinist naturalisation of explanation, and thus, however mistakenly, of judgment, is just that, identity thinking. What is the case, and what is not the case, turn both out to depend on the identity of whoever is making the relevant assertion. Now, of course, and this is also something that we on the left have insufficiently emphasised, this constitutes a quasi-theological form of argumentation. The market is, in many ways, quite literally, the neoliberals' god, just as biology is the god of the social Darwinists and the evolutionary psychologists. And while liberalism itself, classical liberalism, may be understood as a form of idolatry, as I've argued elsewhere, its neoliberal form can hardly be understood otherwise. Again, just as evolutionary psychology can hardly be otherwise understood than as quasi-theology. We are frail and ignorant. We must therefore put our faith and trust in the market, since only the market can truly be said to know anything at all. Nor can the market ever be mistaken. It is omnicompetent, omniscient, and eternal. Again, it needs to be emphasised that this whole story makes no sense, just as Christianity makes no sense, is its strength, not its weakness. It is we who are weak, not the market. Ignorance is thus both a virtue and a tool. Again, just as it is for Christianity. That's why what matters for neoliberalism is ignorance, and why for neoliberals ignorance is quite literally a virtue. The very possibility of genuine knowledge would fatally undermine the neoliberal claim about the epistemic role of the market. And with that gone, the entire ideology goes. Whereas for the traditional ruling classes, people's knowledge is, at best, an inconvenience, more or less dangerous, containable so long as it doesn't spread too far. For the neoliberal revolutionaries, it's much more than that. It removes the ground of their entire ideology. So we shouldn't be surprised, again to quote Mirovsky, that for purposes of public understanding and sloganeering, neoliberal market society must be treated as a natural and inexorable state of mankind. Well, that in very brief, very crude, very bare outline is neoliberalism. Why do all these things matter so much? Why is all this so central when we're trying to think about the neoliberal agenda for our universities? Well, there are many reasons, but I think the main one is this. If this were true, if this were accurate, that would constitute a powerful argument simply for the complete abolition of universities as they're currently understood. Just about. After all, if the job of universities is to produce knowledge, and if producing knowledge is impossible, then universities have no useful function. If it's the case that, quote, if it can't be measured, it's not real, and I'm not making that up, then there can be no point in having real universities. And if universities can be turned into ideological apparatuses of the market, then so much the better, since they'll then help instill precisely that belief. That's why the heart of the neoliberal agenda is quite simply to get rid of universities as producers of knowledge and to limit them to being processors and distributors of information. Processors and distributors of information. And when limited in this way, of course, universities can then contribute positively to the engineering of human souls, and they can help make us all resilient, creative, entrepreneurial, and endlessly flexible as we learn to invest in our own selves and to move forward across the piece. In short, propaganda is all there can be, and so the university's one job is to contribute to that propaganda. Now, of course, education, as we know, has always served two quite contrary needs. On the one hand, continuity, on the other, renewal. Now, provided the numbers are small, that's no great problem. The majority of that small minority will do the continuity bit, and only a small minority of the small minority will ever get into renewal. And anyway, we can always sit on the troublemakers. Remember Socrates, remember Spinoza. A late capitalist culture, however, needs to engage the vast majority for its project, not as producers, of course, but as consumers. And as it becomes more technologically complex, so it needs more and more skills and more information. Nor's that all. With the increasing pace of technological change, there arises a need for people too to be changeable. A flexible and resilient workforce is essential. People need to be able to take on, or rather to have foisted onto them, all sorts of different roles over a lifetime, and an increasingly long one at that. In short, and to put it quite crudely, the old secondary modern business needs to go deeper and to go on for much longer. But that raises a problem of disaffection. Who the hell wants to spend even longer ticking boxes, acquiring skills, and feeding the system what it wants from them? No wonder that schooling and policing are becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish, and all too literally in the United States of America. But that's not the whole story. And it's at this point, I think, that the neoliberal agenda really begins to kick in. It's not just that, as ever, the ruling class has to do its utmost to keep people stupid. That is a traditional occupation. Rather, as I've outlined, the neoliberal revolutionaries are intellectually committed to the view that knowledge is not something that people can have, and that therefore everything, including knowledge, has to be left to the market. And in this, neoliberalism has left more classical liberalism, and indeed everything else, behind. Bernard Mandeville, author of one of the key texts of the liberal tradition, The Fable of the Bees, notoriously insists that, quote, to make society happy, it's requisite that great numbers should be ignorant as well as poor. Nonetheless, even for Mandeville, a minority are fit to be trusted with knowledge, hence the early universities, for example. But as we've seen, neoliberalism denies the very possibility of our avoiding ignorance. Human ignorance is not confined to the labouring classes. Now, as I've already indicated, of course there's an obvious problem here. The neoliberal position is contradictory. How on earth can Hayek and co know that they can't know and that only the market can know? Still, that's not the main point, because, to labour the point, in the world of actually existing politics, contradiction hardly suffices to undermine positions, as anyone working in a UK university knows all too well. In Paul Krugman's rather nice words, quote, inconsistency in the pursuit of useful guidance is no vice. Could almost be Cameron's catchphrase, couldn't it? Take those two facets of neoliberalism together, and its agenda for our universities is obvious. Their very function as producers of knowledge has to be undermined, and the way to undermine it is by monetarising knowledge. Again, as Miroski puts it, quote, if one wholeheartedly subscribes to the neoliberal doctrine of the market as uber-information processor, then reform of the university prescribes the monetisation of knowledge in all its forms. End quote. Hence, of course, the Brown Report, with its infamous one paragraph out of 64 on why higher education matters. I'm not making this up. The Brown Report contained 64 very brief paragraphs. In only one did it say anything at all about why higher education matters. This, for Brown and for his fellow members of the committee, is why higher education matters. I'm quoting from the Brown Report. Higher education matters because it transforms the lives of individuals. On graduating, graduates are more likely to be employed, more likely to enjoy higher wages and better job satisfaction, and more likely to find it easier to move from one job to the next. That's it. That's why higher education matters. That is the whole story. The point is that this is no accident. Neoliberalism's subversion of the very idea of education is deliberate. It's explicit. It's directed at both the means of production of knowledge and at its logical terms and forms. Now, the first of these is pretty obvious because it lies on the surface. Undermining pay and conditions, outsourcing first cleaning, catering, student accommodation, administration, and then, of course, finally, academic work as well. That's, of course, why modularity was introduced. Modularity fragments the very possibility of knowledge, and in doing so it opens up the MOOC market. It's also why fees were introduced, to make higher education into a commodity, and thus to help bring about what the neoliberals claim is the natural case, namely that monetary value is an epistemic category. That's why it doesn't matter that tuition fees turn out to be more expensive than any other system of funding higher education. It's worth the money to monetize knowledge. That's what's going on. The university is being fundamentally undermined as a community dedicated to the production of knowledge, as a cooperative undertaking, and in doing all this, in individualising people's activities, neoliberalism undermines one of the conditions of the production of knowledge, namely cooperation. Now, of course, cooperation is a terrible thing. It runs counter to the figure of the free-floating liberal individual, a figure far too beloved for comfort by all too many academics. That has to go. All that, though, is pretty obvious. It's been said before, it's been noted, it's been noticed. Not much has been done about it, but at least it's been noticed. Neoliberalism's second form of subversion, however, its revolutionary attack on the logical terms and forms of knowledge, appears to have escaped academics' notice no less than it has that of the commentariat. Nonetheless, in terms of the neoliberal agenda, this matters even more than the story I've told so far. And that's why it's so important to see that it's been largely ignored. Let me give you a few examples, or rather one example in a number of different forms. Let's consider just a few of the immediate responses to the Brown Report. Reading those in the Times Higher, which is the academics' trade rag basically, really did make me wonder if our collaboration over the last 25 years with the commodification of the universities, our collusion with student satisfaction surveys, research excellence, impact, and all the rest of the drivel, hasn't finally addled our brains. One commentator bemoaned the Brown proposals because they, quote, risk creating a two-tier system under which most institutions, serving the greater majority of students, will be offering a worse and also more expensive experience. Risk? Risk? That's nonsense. The Brown Report's proposals were designed expressly to achieve exactly this, and they've done so. Here's another example. Quote, The downgrading to non-priority status of the arts, humanities and social sciences will be a disaster for the nation's intellectual and cultural life that undermines the very idea of the university. What a load of rubbish. Far from being a disaster so far as the neoliberal revolutionaries are concerned, it's intended to rid the universities of all this critical nonsense, as if people were actually able to gain knowledge and to improve the world on the basis of that knowledge. Think back to Friedman on New Orleans. The urgent question is whether or not they'll succeed. Nor is it, quote, a huge mistake to value our students simply for what we can get out of them or what they might earn in the future. It's exactly what Brown and his fellow neoliberals intended. Students are supposed to understand themselves as commodities, and once they do so, then, ironically given widening participation, so more and more of the population will have bought into the neoliberal ideology. Or think of how power and control in the university have been taken over to serve the revolution. The standardisation of timetabling, teaching modes and methods, and crucially of assessment. Remember, only that which can be measured matters, and what can be measured can ipso facto be monetarised. Think of the casualisation of both staff and students. Think of the insistence that students are customers whose basic function is to exercise choice. You are what you choose. Things are in fact so bad that today the eminently and classically liberal Baroness Warnock of 1989 sounds like a trot. Imagine trying to persuade today's university managers of what she said. Here it is. The aim of the universities can never be to follow the market in the sense of offering whatever it is that students want. Prospective students often do not know what they want, and certainly do not know what, in order to achieve academic goals, they ought to be given. On the contrary, universities must try to remedy the inability to make intelligent choices forced upon people by their position in the market economy. And here's my favourite bit. The job of universities is to teach students to want the right things, not to give them what they want. Staying with language, think of the very language of university life. What is it but Lewis Carroll on acid? When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, that's all. And so I think that in the longer run, perhaps the single most important thing for any revolution is exactly this, to take charge of language. And that's what the neoliberals have done. So, to my favourite question, what's to be done? Now, there's an important and wide-ranging story to be told, I think, about why so much of the left has actually helped push through the neoliberal agenda, however inadvertently and however ignorantly. And there's also a much more important story, I think, about how what remains of the left might combat the neoliberal revolution. But this is not the place to tell that story, even if I could. Rather, what I want to do here, by way of summing up and finishing, is to focus on what we members of the university, to insist on a very old-fashioned term, might usefully do. And by members, of course, I include everyone working in or for a university, in whatever capacity. Cooks, cleaners, janitors, administrators, researchers, teachers, even managers. How can we collectively resist the extremism of the neoliberal fundamentalists? Well, for certainly 30 years at least, academics have been complaining about the directions in which universities in the United Kingdom have been moving. Relatively lower pay, the ever-increasing ratio of management and administration to academic staff, ever larger classes, the corruption and policing of research, ever-increasing deprofessionalisation, the university as corporation rather than association of members, and so on and on. Today we're saddled with tuition fees, with impact, with online so-called courses, with the withdrawal of state financial support for humanities and social science teaching, with private providers, with outsourcing, and so on and on and on. We know all this. And our protests, such as they have been completely useless. We complain, they, of course, take not the slightest notice. And our own unions continue all too often, though not always, to serve as the employer's poodle. And so the question has to be asked, how come academics are so extraordinarily impotent? Now, one set of answers is to do, I have to say, with individuals' cowardice, complacency, complaisance, corruption, and above all, stupidity. In that, the academic profession, we, are no different from any other bunch of people. But I don't suppose this is really the place to moralise. First, because it would make no difference. Second, because after all, moralising simply deflects attention here as elsewhere from the fundamental causes of the situation. We might need to let off steam occasionally, but it's not any sort of remedy. Rather, what we need is a clear analysis. And a first step in that direction is to recognise not just the political realities and priorities of the neoliberal fundamentalist revolutionaries, to recognise that they are indeed fundamentalists and revolutionaries, and that we're therefore living through a fundamentalist revolution, but also to understand the way in which that revolution and that fundamentalism are both epistemic revolutionary and fundamentalist doctrines. The second, having done that, is to see that action is not some sort of optional extra to the task of understanding what's going on, but a fundamental component. If you don't do, if you don't act, then you haven't understood. So by way of finishing, let me offer you the new version of the Ten Commandments. First, or one, let's take on the task of understanding the epistemic as well as the material reality of what's going on in the fundamentalist neoliberal revolution. 2, let's simply say no to any further commodification. Let's say no to the Stalinist fundamentalists who are busy re-engineering human souls. 3, and as part of that, of course, let's resist the corruption of language and thus the corruption of thought. Let's resist the corruption of language and thought. That is a necessary condition of attaining the nirvana of the neoliberals, i.e. of attaining idiocy. 4, let's keep telling people that we're doing this. Let's not be shy about it. And that's closely related to the 5th commandment. Let's laugh. Go-getting, forward-facing neoliberals hate being laughed at as they yet again move forward across the piece and into the long, dark tea time of the soul. 6, let's at least try not to compete with each other, however hard that might be, in a sector the very raison d'etre of which today is pure competition. 7. Let's make allies. Let's make allies of all of us in the university. With the Campaign for Public Universities, with the Council for the Defence of British Universities, with the trade unions, with everybody. Even more importantly, we have to make common cause with everyone who works in the universities. Porters, administrators, caterers, cleaners, even managers, with anyone who is not yet fully invested in the neoliberal fundamentalist revolution. Anyone who is an opponent in however small a form of neoliberalism is an ally. 8. We should never, ever be seduced into believing the neoliberal and indeed the classically liberal lie that working as an academic requires disinterest. It does not. All education, everywhere, always, is political. 9. Let's try to remember that it's what we do, much more than what we say, that sets an example, whether in the university or outside it. And so finally, the 10th commandment. Let's always remember, as Humpty Dumpty reminds us, that the fundamental question is who is in charge. That's all. Today, it's the neoliberal fundamentalist revolutionaries who are in charge. But it doesn't have to be like that. We need to understand that so far, we've been very largely on the losing side of a revolution, and we need to act accordingly in plotting our counter-revolution. The first step there, as ever, is to exploit the contradictions. As a profession, academics are surely in a better position than just about any other set of workers to do exactly that, to exploit the contradictions. It would be at least a start.
That these people transform that claim into a normative one. They think that value comes from biology. It doesn't. For instance, it's biologically the case, factually the case if you like, that for tens of thousands of years people have been killing each other. That doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it wrong. It's irrelevant. It's a biological fact. So I think the whole attempt to make a social theory out of a biological theory is entirely misplaced. My objection is to people's trying to promote sociobiology, evolutionary psychology as some sort of account of value rather than as a biological explanation of what they're pleased to call human behaviour, which I also think is actually another mistake because they confuse behaviour with action.
Behaviourism is
Yeah, but it's not just behaviourism. It's the very term human behaviour. These people observe the behaviour of ants, for instance, and mount an argument by analogy from the behaviour of ants to what they call the behaviour of human beings. But even if that analogy had some sense to it, they're getting it wrong, because the comparison isn't between the behaviour of ants and the behaviour of people, but between the behaviour of ants and the actions of people. So that's a very sort of short story, but happy to talk about it more in the pub afterwards.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a question there.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that as well. I think I also had a problem with that bit, actually. Just in terms of, theology as well, and the fact that Darwin when everyone believed, that God created us all and challenged that. So I think to say that that in itself is ideology kind of takes us off the point. I mean, sure enough, survival of the fittest, use that, because that is not something that we want to stick with. But I think it just takes us off your key points, which are really valuable and worth kind of holding on to and acting.
I think there's a long story to be told, both about the interrelations between neoliberalism and sociobiology, and between the logical form of sociobiology and the logical form of monotheistic beliefs. I'm not going to bore you with that story now, but I will say one thing. Darwin's story did not challenge Christianity one iota. It made absolutely no difference to it. When the theory was published in 1859, there was an immediate uproar and there was a debate, blah, blah. 4 or 5 years later, even the most backward vicar in some rural parish had forgotten about it. Why? Because if you're, for instance, a Christian, you can carry on believing whatever you want to believe about God, Christ and everything else without any challenge from biology at all. And apart from a few, shall we say, benighted people in southern states of the United States, the rest of the world has no problem with this. Here is the story of the evolution of species. That process was set in chain by something called God. Where's the problem? But more importantly, I think, that it is the way that sociobiology imports, as I was saying earlier on, normativity or value to an empirical story. And actually, one of the ironies of the history of ideas is that it doesn't know it. People like Dawkins certainly don't know it. But it models itself on Christian theology, which is actually an attempt to do the same thing. But if you don't like that bit of the story, just ignore it. Because that's a lot more important than my views about sociobiology and religious belief.
Okay, next to Naomi.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bob. Your Ten Commandments, or the Ten Commandments, or a version of the Ten Commandments, they certainly take on the sort of aspect of theology, even ironically. So my question, well, I've got two questions. One to you is, if they seem to be very similar to the feminist project, which I would say that they are. I mean, for instance, Let's Laugh at These People reminds me of Zizou, the larger woman, and Laugh at the producer. Why so late? Why so late to that feminist project? And the second question, more generally, is why does it take neoliberalism to focus us behind this agenda?
Good questions. Irony is sometimes good, I think. But more importantly, yes, I entirely agree with you about the feminist project. Why so late? You tell me. I don't know.
Because I'm a woman?
No, nothing to do. It's to do with your age. Not to do with your gender. No. Why so? I don't know. I don't know what happened. I mean, here we are in 2015. You read feminist texts from the early 1970s and people think you're insane. All those insights have been lost. Well, I don't know why they've been lost, but they have been. I think that's right. Why neoliberalism? Why it's taken neoliberalism to force the issue, I think is a very interesting question. I think there's a political story there to be told, and it's a very long political story about neoliberalism as the revolutionary reassertion of the status quo ante after the Second World War. But even more importantly, I think that I was actually quite serious about the stupidity of the academy. I'm old enough to remember arguments in the 1980s and 1990s about all sorts of issues that have now been resolved. Modules, standardised assessment, all this sort of stuff. And thinking, what's going on here? Because it was always the people on the left who put these things in place, fetishising student choice. I remember asking a rather august meeting once, the academic board no less, if anybody could give me a reason why student choice was a good thing. And it was as though I'd farted in the wrong place. Nobody said anything at all, because of course nobody had an answer. And yet the left was sufficiently unanalytic to confuse, as a very clever neoliberal Stephen Davis told us about 2 years ago here, to confuse politics with lifestyle. So I think that's one of the things that happened. Why academics? Why it's taken academics so long? There's, again, doubtless a long story, but one important story is that academics have traditionally, and particularly actually in the arts and the humanities, seen themselves as lonely individuals ploughing their own furrow, for whom the university is there to provide study leave and a backdrop for pursuing what one's really interested in, namely one's research, rather than teaching. And I think that individualism, of which the left is at least as guilty as any other section of academics, actually plays a large part in that. But any further than that, I don't know. People need to do some research on it. And I'm serious about that.
Okay, I've got quite a big build-up of questions coming.
Just shut me up.
No, that's okay. But yeah, I've got a good 7 people now. So first was you at the back there, the leather jacket. No, you.
Sorry. Yeah, my question was, you talked about an open conspiracy, and at the end you talked about who's in charge. Since the neoliberal agenda since Reagan and Thatcher, how does the conspiracy, the open conspiracy, which everybody seems to be aware of and has discussed it in one way or the other, how does it actually sustain itself, and how does that conversation carry on in the sort of backwards power? Is it a deliberate thing, or is it actually even more subtle than that?
I don't think it's all that subtle, actually. Literally, look at the website of the Mont Pelerin Society.
I know, it's all absolutely
It's all
clear.
there, it's all absolutely clear. Look at who goes to Davos and what they talk about. Look at the way in which, for instance, our dearly beloved government uses language and actually steals what used to be the left's language from it. The living wage is now something very different from what it was 10 weeks ago, and so on and so forth. But I use the term conspiracy very, very deliberately, because of course it's a contradiction. If it's a conspiracy, it has to be secret, but this isn't secret. But I want to use the term nonetheless, because I think the left needs to understand that it's no good just, if you like, saying, but look, this is no good, this is terrible. The left needs to actually actively plan and conspire together to change things, rather than just keeping its fingers crossed that historical inevitability will somehow deliver us from neoliberalism. It won't. It has to be planned and plotted.
In the same way that it's published on your website, however, it wouldn't necessarily be having an open discussion about having like a neoliberal meeting to make everybody stupid. I mean, they might do, I'm sure they do, in my mind, my understanding of things.
I'll finish by saying again one of the things I said towards the end. What matters more than what we think is what we do.
Sure.
Okay, Toby.
Thanks, Bob. That was great. It's just something I'm trying to get my head around based on what you said. It's the relationship between the idea that the Mont Pelerin Society was set up to stop the lefties after the Second World War, stop social democracy, and so on. And because of this, they come up with the idea that you can't have knowledge, the critique of knowledge that follows. But I just wonder that they want to stop this stuff, this social democratic tyranny, yeah? Because they believe in certain things as being good and right and true. So on the one hand you have that position, on the other hand you have the critique of knowledge. So I'm wondering whether it's not just a contradiction, but it's actually a lie. And if it's a lie, what's the lie for? What's the plot that you see?
That's a really good question. I have no idea whether it's a lie or not.
Right.
Certainly it's a contradiction.
Sure.
I have no insight into what goes on, so to speak, in Hayek's head. I don't know if he's deliberately lying or whether he just can't see that the position's contradictory. I mean, that element of the position. In the sense, I say the same about something like Tony Blair. I mean, is he a liar? Is he so stupid that he no longer knows whether he's lying or not? Does he not understand the distinction? I have no idea. But functionally, there is a contradiction here. The only thing I disagree with you about is when you said that what the Montpellier Society set itself up to change was the cause of their view of epistemology. It wasn't, it's the other way around. Hayek and his mates genuinely, which is why it's so important, genuinely do think that only the market can produce knowledge, which is why they support the market. It's not the other way around. It's not, if you like, a cynical belief. Maybe a false belief, but it's not cynical at all.
So if it is a lie, it's a kind of a confusion.
It's a real lie, yeah. Yeah, serious one.
Just to follow up then quickly, if I may. Is it therefore, okay, so then it's not a plot in a sense. What is the goal? What is the...
The goal is to change what people are, because the main difference between an important difference between neoliberalism and classical liberalism is that classical liberals have a view of what human beings are really like. We won't go into it, but individual, atomic, blah, blah, blah. The neoliberals are not so stupid. They don't think that there's some essential human nature. They know, and they say, that human beings have to be changed into this sort of thing for their revolution to succeed. And that's why they have to be taken very seriously, because they're not appealing to human nature. They're quite open about this.
Okay, blue shirt.
I was taking the question. I study marketing and selling stuff, and I think neoliberalism is really good at selling. And with that in mind, they've sold this idea to another generation of students. They're all going to graduate, it's going to get bigger and there's going to be more of it. Where do they fit into the 10 Commandments in terms of how students stop it? They weren't prevailing in the speech.
That's a very good question. If I had a quick answer to it, I probably wouldn't be standing here talking about it. My real answer to you is that I don't know. The only claim I'd make is that we have to start from where we are. And where we are at various stages of our lives is university. And that's going to become true of an increasing proportion of the population. I mean, the fact actually that nearly 50% of school leavers are going to university ought to be something that the left can take advantage of. Because we now have access to half the population instead of to 7% of it. So let's have a fight with the neoliberals. Now, what then happens, I don't know. Of course I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say ask Marx, because I don't think that works either. I don't know what's going to happen. At the moment, there are solid grounds for extreme pessimism. On the other hand, if we'd been here in 1988, and somebody had said to us, tell you what, Berlin Wall's going to fall next year, they would have been laughed out of the room. So that's a little bit of optimism, if you like.
Okay. You?
Do you think that this religious freedom that neoliberalism holds dear to itself may have facilitated some of the ignorance that has arisen that you're talking about?
No, neoliberalism doesn't have anything to say about religious freedom. It's not an important part of its plan at all. It can put up with any form of freedom or lack of it, depending on what's convenient. Because all that matters is what the market does. So that
Okay.
they don't need to care about that.
I'd just like you to clarify a little bit. I might be a bit confused. Are you saying that with a neoliberal university cannot produce knowledge as you understand it? And if so, what's the distinction? Your distinction between knowledge and information?
Okay, great. No, even a neoliberal university can produce knowledge, but it's going to do so either accidentally or in the face of opposition, or both. We are in a neoliberal university here. There's no question of that. But we're not entirely unsuccessful in also exploiting the contradiction of being in that position and actually, I think, between us collectively producing some knowledge. The difference between knowledge and information, that's a lovely question, and it's very hard to answer it very quickly. But broadly speaking, if you go on to, say, a quiz show, or if you go to the pub and what do you think it's called? Pub quiz, thank you. And you take part in those, it's about information. It's not knowledge, because it serves no purpose. Information becomes important only in its use, and it's at that point that information can be transformed into knowledge. So information, if you like, is neutral in terms of what happens in the world. Knowledge isn't. But that's a very long story, and I suspect most people will disagree with it. But I think knowledge is already a normative concept, i.e. that you don't know something unless you're actually doing something on the basis of that knowledge.
Can you talk in a pub?
Yeah,
Okay.
For hours.
Gentleman in the middle there.
Lovely, thanks Bob, that was really interesting. I think we all really need to hear that quite regularly, unfortunately. But one thing I was thinking of is about reinforcing the aspect that there's a social aspect to this, is that you're right about the plot, the conspiracy, I mean it's hiding in plain sight. But this idea that one way of challenging it, resisting it, is the idea that neoliberalism is out there, or the market is out there. You know, there's an invisible hand. I mean, I'm not sure if I have an invisible hand I would use to control the market, but that's maybe me. But the idea is done by people. There's people, Davos, politicians, economists, people who are then selling this, marketing this idea. And actually, we need to challenge those people, as opposed to this abstract concept.
I entirely agree with you. The only purpose of, if you like, getting to grips with some of the theory is because I think we need to do that in order to understand that what you've said is the case actually is the case. Yeah, we need to attack these people. Now, we don't need necessarily to do that physically. Not in a university. But we nonetheless need to attack them. We need to attack them verbally, and we need to attack them communicatively. And I was entirely serious when I think often the best thing to do in any number of meetings in a university these days is just laugh. And I don't think we do that enough. We don't ridicule people. And ridicule is very, very important in the United Kingdom. It's one of the few weapons that the rulers are always very uncomfortable about. They don't like being ridiculed, they don't like being embarrassed, they don't like being laughed at. Why? Who knows? But it doesn't matter why. It's enough that it's the case, and we can use that.
Dave?
Hi. I think it was Jameson that said that postmodernism was the cultural logic of capitalism. I was wondering if you agree with that, and to what extent do you think postmodernism and neoliberalism complement each other?
Yes, I do agree with it, and a lot. But I don't think that's the whole story. And I think one has to, even I think I have to be a bit nuanced about that. The important thing is that neoliberalism's easy ally is a sort of silly postmodernism which relativizes everything. Because of course then if nothing can be the case, then nothing can be denied. And I think that's important. The irony is that of course neoliberalism's claims themselves are anything but postmodern, because they actually have a very clear epistemological standpoint. But the details of the interplay are long and complicated. Again, happy to talk in the pub.
Sorry, I'll write you down, just remind me a minute. I've got Claire next.
I just wanted to ask you about it, the 10th Commandment. I wonder if actually struggle, which at the moment we're losing really badly. I'm not even sure it's the best terrain academics, certainly, for them to fight them. But when we think about the use of knowledge, I wonder if actually knowledge is about undermining mastery rather than find it, asking questions, critiquing, bringing that down, looking at it differently. And so I wonder if I'd like to keep Humpty Dumpty and number 10 there, well, not the 10 in general, but actually I think what I'd like to do is to use that stuff on language and move away from the language of mastery. I don't know what you think about it.
I think I probably agree. I hadn't thought about it actually, but I think you're right. And now I'll take it away again, just very, very slightly. I think that would be an excellent tactic, but I think we need to be clear that it's a struggle for who wins. And mastery is perhaps not the best way of expressing it. But no, I think you're right. After all, if the neoliberals can steal the left's language, we can leave some of their language. And when Vicky was talking about actually marketing the programme, I completely agree with it. Yes, let's use those. Let's use that language, and let's not apologise for using it, because it's much harder for liberals to oppose that. Niche marketing, brands, yes. After all, and historically, this is actually, the more I think about what you said, the more I think it is. Historically, this humanities programme got going by licking the right's language. It was sold to the university back in the late 1980s on the basis of something called transferable skills. Speaking, writing, listening, all that sort of stuff. Except we added one word which they didn't notice. We put in the word academic. Transferable academic skills. Nobody noticed, it was great. But we had a list of big name employers, most of whom have gone bankrupt since then, saying what a wonderful idea this was. What better way to prepare students for work than by teaching them skills? Skills of critique, skills of synthesis, all that sort of stuff. And actually, if you can just pull that away for a moment, from the way all that sort of thinking is corrupted, there's nothing wrong with the idea of being intellectually skilled. It's actually quite a good idea. People need to learn to read and write.
On that subject, the advert's actually right in part.
Yes.
It's bad, nothing inspirational about words inspire, and the fact that universities are all the same. But anyway, I've got 6 more questions. I need someone to be neoliberal. I need someone to kind of make the case for why the student experience should be at the centre of university education, or why value for money is very important, why they should be able to get their money back if they're not fully 100% satisfaction guaranteed. So I've got Nadia next. So some of you come on, think of something. We need to challenge them here. We need to harness the spirit.
It's quite a neoliberal thing, but I'm thinking about the neoliberal incursions into education generally, so not just universities. What's been happening to universities is just one aspect of what's been happening to the attacks on education from early years right. And so my question is about, in that context then, is it right to say that maybe it's appropriate for a university to enter the market that's being generated for schools? So where schools are effectively being privatised through academisation and so on, is it right in that context to say of a university, well actually they would be a better sponsor of schools than the Harris Academy, which after all came out of selling carpets. So surely it's better for a university. So yes, clearly you can tell what I think, but I'd be interested in what you think.
No, I think it's a good question, and I think that actually it's a matter of tactics where one goes in those different states. I think my basic view would be that however tempting it might be to go in that direction, one of the outcomes would be not just what happens to the school, but what happens to the university. And I think that's good enough not to do it. you know, sometimes I think, well, think of something like the Free University of Brighton, for instance, which I think is a great idea. It's actually partly sponsored by the Community University Partnership, so it's quite ironic. But the logic of it, of course, is that these people declare independence. And that, of course, is problematic. And that's been a problem, I think, for the left forever. The extent to which actually retreating in and using the language and the forms in the end corrupts what you're doing. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. I think it's actually a serious question. I think the answer is universities shouldn't get involved in schools. In the same way that, for instance, local councils run out of money, the only sensible thing is for the councillors to resign and to leave the Tories to sit.
I've got 8 people wanting questions, 6 minutes, make them quick. But we maybe can have another 5 minutes. Go on, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. This is a naive, deliberately naive question. On the question of resistance within the university, why is it that those who are in the upper echelons of the university, the vice chancellors, the senior management, never challenge this process?
No, they never challenge this process because the sort of person who these days could get a job like that would be doing challenging. If they wanted to do some challenging, they would need to make the longest.
That suggests that they have done so in the past.
No,
I different people, is that your...
No, well, the pool of people from whom these are chosen are very different from what it was even 10 years ago. I mean, no sane left-wing believer in higher education would these days want the job as a senior manager in a university because the structures are such that you can't do the job properly. So that's lost. That's gone. In Ireland, they still elect the Vice Chancellor. Imagine that happening here.
Okay.
We live in an age of so-called liberal democracy where the public are invited and given opportunities through the media to express their own ideas. We use a language of emotion which I would think was perhaps unheard of 40 years ago. People are much more open in the language they use to express themselves. Is this counter to the language of neoliberalism, or is it part of the conspiracy that just to allow people to have the sense that they have a chance to say what they think and therefore to be ignored, or is it possible that it could have any force, that could be rallied to counter the neoliberalism?
I'm very pessimistic about that, actually. I think the sort of current fashion for emoting all over the place is simply to substitute lifestyle for politics. And it's to care about the accidents and the trivialities of people's lives rather than what actually matters. So I think it serves the neoliberals' purpose altogether.
Okay, you? Sorry.
My question is re-coordinated, so I don't know again, because I was so shocked by the marketing spiel that followed the lecture. And my question's gone up its own arse, really. But the lecture has, I think, actually, because you kind of said that you accept this marketing strategy for university places. I just wonder if there's a better way of recruiting students to university, to use that phrase. And I'm disappointed by the criticisms of the Free University. So it's not a question now, because it's gone, I had to reframe my thoughts, but I just feel shocked by the juxtaposition of the two sequences.
I'm glad there's some shock, because I think it's appropriate. Now, who's right and who's wrong in this, it doesn't really matter so much. But no revolution has ever succeeded to the extent that any revolution ever has without adopting at least some of the structures and language of what it's supposed to. Otherwise we have Pol Pot, and that's not revolution but devastation.
Depends what you say in the videos, though.
Sorry?
Depends what you say in the videos, though.
Look.
Depends what you say in the videos. You don't have to say, oh, I can't hear great spending
money.
No, of course
Saying
not.
start organising meetings, eh?
No, and that's what's meant. We can use the contradictions that neoliberalism inevitably consists in for our own purposes. This degree programme has a good brand name. It does. I wish it were a different world, but it isn't. We have to start from where we are. And in doing that, we have to be particularly careful not actually to lose our values in this sort of game that we play. And that's not always easy. But we can't sort of say, we reject absolutely everything, the entire game is one which we won't play, because then we'll have no students and the place is closed down and these opportunities won't be there for everybody. There might come a time where that's appropriate. I don't know. But we're not there yet.
I'm just going to let Vicky come in, because
Yeah.
she's probably going to speak to this.
Just very quickly, I completely appreciate your response. I was very aware of some issues as I was speaking. As Bob says, we need students or we can't do what we do. It's that simple. But I would also just say to everybody in this room that the first thing I was talking about is the fact that we may be needing students' help over the next year. And the website is only one part of that. There are other ways in which we may be speaking with you in the weeks and months to come.
Can I just add one thing? I asked a very neoliberal question to the tutors. I said, what's the value of this course? I talk about these criteria that introduce what I'm getting at. And the answer I get back, it's a very stupid question, but the answer I get back is different to a more neoliberal department. You might ask that question. So it is a neoliberal exercise nonsense, but it depends who you're speaking to.
Okay, very quickly.
Just to say quickly, that I work in a sixth form college and we've got our open evening tomorrow night, for example, but we say to the parents, you have to sell you our college. We make it blatantly, in my department anyway, but we make it blatantly clear that we have got no other option but to sell our college and our particular course in order for us to keep our jobs. Alongside that, of course, we explain how good it is and why they should come to it, and we give all the academic reasons. But we're very upfront about it, and you have to be.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Quick.
The liberals have the market, the Christians have God, whom have we got?
Ourselves.
Okay, Mark.
By which I mean across each other.
Anthony wanted a neoliberal provocation. Bob suggested the state is lost because the state in effect implements neoliberal requirements, adapts for capital. University management is lost. The administrative services are in effect being privatised so that schools purchase from the university their providers. Why don't we then accept the neoliberal logic? Follow it through to its ultimate conclusion. Academics who run programs declare independence from the universities and then go to the different universities to see which ones provide the best services. The question then is how we raise our money. We can do that through fees if we have to, but we could look at other mechanisms. But if that happens, then what will happen is the universities go with the academic programs. They don't go with the administrative services. The problem at the moment is academics have lost the programs to managerial caste. And I use the word caste on purpose with all its connotations, who in effect run the university. So why don't we follow the logic all the way through to what Willits himself suggested, which is that administrative services could be outsourced. Why don't we outsource the administration and not the academy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It may be that politically at some point that will actually be the way to go. The only way left. And I'm using that word. I don't think we can rule that sort of thing out in advance at all. At some point it might be necessary for academics to set up their own institutions. And that goes back to the Free University of Brighton, which is in some ways is an embryonic attempt to be doing something like that, and it's to be very much welcome.
Okay, green shirt, very quick.
I was also playing the character of the neoliberal.
Good.
Why is the focus on jobs such a bad thing?
Because I think that most of the students are going to leave university and we're going to go to call centres because that's where our degrees will take us. And it's just true. And it seems like we need philosophers in the same way that we need painters and artists. And they're really nice at parties and they're great fun. But I'm really happy, and my bank and my financial security is really happy that my parents did chemistry and computer science instead of what I'm doing.
Chemistry is an unfortunate example because chemistry departments up and down the country are closing. That's not an ad hominem point. That's to say that those sorts of consideration are always short-term considerations. We don't know what sorts of work are going to be required in 10 years' time. Second point is that nothing I said implied that there's something wrong with people learning things in order to find certain jobs, in order to do certain jobs. For instance, it seems to me a good idea that bus drivers learn to drive. But, as my favourite classical liberal John Stuart Mill said, the job of universities is not to produce the shoemaker, but to produce an educated shoemaker or whatever they turn out to be. So there's nothing wrong with training for jobs, that's fine, and then there's a long story to be told about what sort of jobs there ought to be and what not to be. But education is something completely different. There's nothing wrong with being a taxi driver, there's something wrong with being an uneducated taxi driver.
And it's employability being the criteria, right?
Yeah.
But Oscar, last question, and then I'm going to say something.
I was a libertarian in my first year, so I'm taking up the neoliberal challenge. Why should you care what any other university does? And indeed, why should any other university pay any attention to what you think they should do? The wonderful thing that neoliberalism, the opportunity it provides us, is that it gives us a free market that if we want to set up any centre, we can set it up. If you want to set up a centre for your left-wing critical theorists, do it. And maybe they'll come to you and be marketed in the right way. So why should anyone care what you think?
I think that is actually the most important question that's been asked all evening. I think you're absolutely right. And the answer to that is because if people were to act on the basis of the sort of thinking I've outlined, then the neoliberals would be in trouble. That's why they want to take notice. Okay. Knowledge is always for the sake of action. And I think academics do themselves a disservice by pretending otherwise.
I just want to ask the students something. I don't want you to answer me now, but later. But one thing that would be genuinely radical to do to try and counter some of the logics that Bob's talking about, in particular competitivity, would to be eradicate marks. I just want to know how you would feel if you never received a grade, you didn't get a first or 2-1, no grading, just a completely different form of assessment. I also think faculty could think about that as well, to challenge the logic of competitivity and selling yourself according to what grade, or you've got to get a 2-1 away from, otherwise you're not going to get a job. No, from the University of Brighton Humanities Programme, you just get a degree in knowledge and critical thinking, that's it. And I'd like to know how you'd feel about that, if you think it would work, especially as a marketing tool. I just want to thank Bob for a brilliant talk.
Just be 1 minute. We're from Free Education Brighton. We've been organising against specifically what we've been talking about tonight. We've made small victories across the place. We stormed offices, we forced meetings, we won meetings. But we need more people. We need more people to continue this fight. On the 18th of November, we're going to hold a mass meeting with unions, staff and students about where to go. This fight needs people and this fight can be won. Look at Quebec a couple of years ago, top of the fucking government. We can do it. Come along.